Deutschland.
January 17th, 1945. Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The transport truck rattled to a halt on frozen gravel. Through the canvas flaps, 34 women peered out at a landscape alien to everything they knew. Rolling hills blanketed in clean snow, unmarred by craters or ash. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, not cordite in decay. In the distance, low barracks sat arranged in neat rows beneath a sky so blue it seemed impossible, as though war had never touched this corner of the world. The women, most in their 20s, a few barely past girlhood, climbed down from the truck with stiff limbs and hollow eyes. They wore mismatched Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, threadbare wool coats, and boots held together with wire. Their hands were raw from cold and labor. Their faces bore the pallor of months spent in transit camps, in the bellies of ships, in the uncertainty of capture. They had been told they were prisoners of war. They had been told they were being transferred to an internment facility in the American interior, but no one had explained what that meant. In their minds, the word camp carried only one definition, shaped by whispers and rumors that had seeped through the ranks in the final months of the Reich's collapse: barbed wire and watchtowers, starvation rations, forced labor until your body gave out, guards who saw you not as human but as enemy, as threat, as less than livestock. They expected brutality because brutality was all they had known, all they had seen, all their ideology had taught them to expect from a world divided into victors and vanquished. The American officer waiting for them was a woman. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Brewster, Army Nurse Corps, stood at the gate with a clipboard under one arm and an expression that communicated neither cruelty nor pity, only efficiency and a kind of brisk professionalism. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pinned beneath her cap, and she wore a heavy olive overcoat against the January wind. Behind her stood 2 MPs, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, and a cluster of female clerical staff holding blankets and paperwork. No dogs, no whips, no shouting. "You will be processed inside," Colonel Brewster said in clipped but comprehensible German. "You will be given medical examinations, issued bedding, and assigned to quarters. You were prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated accordingly." The women stood in silence. Some blinked against the light. Others stared at the ground. One girl, no more than 19, began to cry quietly, tears freezing on her cheeks. Another woman, older, with the hard eyes of someone who had served in occupied Poland, muttered something under her breath, something about propaganda, about tricks, about Americans and their lies. She had been a Blitzmodell, a communications auxiliary, and she had spent 2 years listening to Goebbels' broadcasts, to the promises that the enemy was barbaric, that capture meant death or worse. She did not believe the colonel. She could not afford to. They were led through the gate. It was not locked. The story of German women held as prisoners of war in the United States is one largely erased from popular memory, overshadowed by the broader narrative of male POWs, by the vast camps that held hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers across the American South and Midwest. But between 1944 and 1946, several hundred German women, mostly military auxiliaries, nurses, and civilian technical staff captured in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Germany itself, were interned at locations like Fort Devens, Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, and smaller facilities scattered from Texas to New York. They were secretaries who had typed supply orders for the Afrika Korps, radio operators who had transmitted coded messages from bunkers in Normandy, nurses who had treated wounded SS officers in field hospitals, cooks, clerks, drivers, and translators, women who had worn the uniform, taken the oath, believed in the cause, and found themselves in the war's final months, swept up in the chaotic collapse of the Thousand-Year Reich. They had been raised in a society that told them women were guardians of the home, vessels of racial purity, supporters of their men but never warriors themselves. Yet the Reich, desperate for manpower, had conscripted their labor, had placed them in quasi-military roles, had sent them into occupied territories where the line between civilian and combatant blurred into nothing. By 1945, these women had seen things no propaganda film had prepared them for. The retreat from Stalingrad, the disintegration of Army Group Center, the firebombing of Hamburg, the slow realization that the war was lost and that the ideology they had served was crumbling into myth and ash. And now they were here, in America. The land their Fuhrer had called weak, decadent, mongrel. the land where, they had been told, discipline did not exist, where society was fractured by capitalism and racial impurity, where strength had been replaced by softness and the people were too spoiled, too divided, too cowardly to fight a real war. They had been taught that Americans were inferior, that their soldiers were amateurs, that their women were frivolous, that their civilization was a facade held together by Jewish bankers and Hollywood delusions. They had been taught to despise this place even as they feared it. They had not been taught that the first thing the Americans would give them was a hot meal. The mess hall at Fort Devens was a long, low-ceilinged room warmed by coal stoves, lined with wooden tables and benches scrubbed clean. The women entered in a shuffling line, still silent, still wary. The smell hit them first. Fresh bread, real coffee, something frying eggs perhaps, or bacon. The scent was so foreign, so impossibly rich, that several women stopped in their tracks. One, a former signals operator named Greta Schumacher, would later recall that moment in an interview conducted in 1978 for a small regional history project in post-war Germany. She said the smell made her dizzy. She said she thought she was hallucinating. They were handed metal trays, not wooden bowls, not tin cups dented and rusted. Proper trays, partitioned into sections. An American soldier herself, a woman, a walk private with dark hair and a tired smile, spoons scrambled eggs onto the tray. Another ladled oatmeal. Another placed 2 slices of white bread, soft and pillowy, next to a small square of butter wrapped in wax paper. There was a cup of coffee, black and steaming, and a glass of milk, cold and white. There was sugar in a bowl on the table, freely available. There was salt. There was jam made from strawberries, bright red and thick as paint. The women sat. They did not speak. They stared at the food as though it might vanish if they blinked. Several did not eat immediately. They were afraid it was a trick, a psychological tactic designed to make them weak, to make them compliant. They had learned in the last months of the war that hope was a weapon wielded against you. Better to expect nothing. Better to assume cruelty. That way you could not be broken, but hunger is a force more powerful than ideology. One by one, they began to eat. The eggs were real, not powder or paste. The bread was soft, not sawdust and grit. The butter melted on their tongues, rich and fatty and impossibly sweet. The coffee was bitter but hot, and it burned away the numbness in their throats. They ate slowly at first, then faster, then with the desperate mechanical rhythm of people who had not known plenty in years. Some cried as they ate, others sat rigid, staring at nothing, jaws working methodically. One woman vomited into her tray and was quietly escorted to the infirmary, her stomach unable to process richness after months of deprivation. Greta Schumacher would later say that this was the first crack. The first moment she understood that everything she had been told about America was a lie, not because the food was good that could be explained away, a temporary kindness before the real punishment began, but because of what happened after the meal. Because of what the American colonel said when the trays were cleared and the women sat hunched over the empty tables, waiting for orders, waiting for the labor details, waiting for the guards to march them to the barracks and lock the doors. Colonel Brewster stood at the front of the hall. She did not shout. She spoke in clear, measured German, translated by a slight woman in civilian clothes who stood beside her. A former schoolteacher from Munich who had emigrated in 1938 and now worked for the War Department. The colonel said, "You are prisoners of war. You will be housed in barracks. You will be assigned work details, but only light-duty cleaning, kitchen assistance, clerical tasks. You will be paid a small stipend for your labor. You will be allowed to send and receive mail, subject to censorship. You will be allowed to attend religious services if you wish. You will have access to a library, and you will be permitted to walk freely within the perimeter of the camp during daylight hours. You are not to approach the fences, but within the camp itself you may move as you please." Silence. Absolute silence. Then, from the back of the room, a voice thin, disbelieving. "We can walk without guards." "Without guards," the colonel confirmed. "We are not to be locked in the barracks. You will be locked at night for your own safety and ours. During the day, you are free to move about the camp." Another voice, sharp and bitter. "You lie. This is propaganda. You will photograph us and use it against Germany." The colonel did not flinch. "You are welcome to believe what you wish. The rules stand." The barracks were not cells. Each building housed 20 women in bunk beds, arranged in 2 neat rows, with a coal stove at the center and windows that let in actual daylight. There were mattresses, thin but present, and woolen blankets, 2 per woman. There were hooks on the wall for clothing. There was a latrine attached to each barracks, with toilets that flushed in sinks with running water. Cold water, yes, but clean. No lice, no rats, no mud. The women moved through the space like ghosts. They touched the walls as though testing their solidity. They sat on the bunks and said nothing. One woman, Ilse Richter, a former nurse from a field hospital in Tunisia, lay down on her bunk fully closed and stared at the ceiling beams for 3 hours without moving. Later, she would say she was waiting for the ceiling to collapse, for the floor to give way, for the dream to end and the real camp to reveal itself beneath. She had seen prisoners before. She had treated wounded POWs, British, American, French colonial troops in the hospital before they were shipped to camps in Germany and Poland. She had seen how they were treated. She had seen the bruises, the infections, the hollow eyes. She had told herself it was necessary, that war was brutal, that the enemy deserved no better. Now she was the prisoner. Now she waited for the Americans to show their true nature. But the Americans did not come with clubs. They came with clipboards. Over the next 3 days, each woman was given a medical examination by army doctors and nurses, professional, clinical, occasionally brusque but never cruel. They were checked for lice and tuberculosis, for malnutrition and frostbite. They were vaccinated. They were given clean underwear, socks, and standard-issue POW uniforms. Denim coveralls dyed with a large PW stenciled on the back in white paint. They were given toothbrushes and soap and small towels. These were not luxuries. These were baseline provisions mandated by the Geneva Convention, but to women who had spent the final months of the war in a collapsing Reich where soap was a memory and toothbrushes were artifacts of the vanished world, they felt like miracles. On the 4th day, the women began to test the boundaries, not in organized rebellion, but in small, hesitant gestures. Retta Schumacher stepped outside her barracks in the morning and stood on the wooden steps, breathing the cold air, half expecting a guard to shout at her, to order her back inside. No one shouted. She walked down the steps. She walked toward the next barracks. Still no one stopped her. She kept walking, past the mess hall, past the administrative building, past a small recreation yard where a volleyball net sagged between 2 poles. She walked until she reached the perimeter fence, a simple chain-link barrier topped with barbed wire 12 feet high, but hardly the fortress of her imagination. On the other side, she could see a road, trees, a distant farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. She stood there for 20 minutes, gripping the cold metal links, and no one told her to move. That afternoon, she returned to the barracks and told the others. Some did not believe her. They said she must have been followed, that she was being tested, that the Americans were gathering evidence to justify harsher treatment. But the next day, others ventured out. Ilse Richter walked to the library, a small, wood-paneled room in the administrative building stocked with German-language books donated by American churches and cultural organizations. There were novels by Goethe and Schiller, medical textbooks, even a few pre-war newspapers. She sat in a chair by the window and wept silently, holding a copy of Faust in her lap, because she could not reconcile the existence of this room with the world she thought she inhabited. Within a week, the women began to walk freely. Not all of them, some remained in the barracks, paralyzed by fear or ideology or simple exhaustion, but enough. They walked to the mess hall without escort. They gathered in small clusters near the stoves to talk in low voices. They attended Protestant services in the chapel, a plain wooden structure where an army chaplain read from the Bible in German and did not mention the war. They lined up for mail call and received letters from home, censored but real, thin pages covered in spidery handwriting from mothers and sisters and husbands in British or Soviet captivity. They began, slowly, to understand that they were not going to be starved, beaten, or worked to death. And this understanding shattered them in ways physical cruelty never could. There's a psychological phenomenon documented by psychiatrists who studied returning POWs in the decades after World War II, a phenomenon that German prisoners in American custody experienced more acutely than almost any other group. It is the collapse of certainty. It is the dismantling of a worldview so total, so absolute, that its absence leaves a void where identity once stood. The women at Fort Devens had been raised in a totalitarian state that provided answers to every question: who you were, what you believed, who your enemies were, why you fought. The state told you that your sacrifice was noble, that your suffering had meaning, that your enemies were subhuman monsters who would destroy you if given the chance. And if you questioned, you were not merely wrong, you were a traitor, a defeatist, a threat to the community. So you did not question. You internalized. You believed. And then you were captured. And the enemy did not destroy you. They fed you. They gave you soap and blankets and books. They let you walk in the open air. They treated you in ways small and large, as though you were human. This was not mercy. Or rather, it was not only mercy, it was policy. The United States, despite its flaws, despite the deep racism that would intern Japanese Americans and segregate its own troops, adhered more strictly to the Geneva Convention than any other major combatant in World War II. American POW camps were inspected by the International Red Cross. Prisoners were paid for their labor. They were housed in conditions that, while Spartan, met minimum standards of hygiene and nutrition. They were not tortured. They were not summarily executed. This was not because Americans were inherently more virtuous. Indeed, they were documented cases of abuse, of shootings, of neglect, but institutionally, systematically, the United States treated its European prisoners of war as human beings entitled to basic rights. This was strategic as much as ethical. It ensured reciprocal treatment for American POWs. It avoided inflaming neutral opinion, and it reinforced the narrative that the Allies were fighting for: civilization against barbarism. But for the women at Fort Devens, the reasons did not matter. The effect was the same. They had been told that Americans were weak, chaotic, degenerate. They had been told that American society was on the verge of collapse, that its people were divided and cowardly, that its material wealth was a hollow shell concealing moral rot. They had been told that if they were captured, they would be raped, enslaved, discarded. None of this was true. And the truth was more terrifying than any lie, because it meant that everything else they had been told about the war, about the Reich, about the righteousness of their cause, might also be false. Greta Schumacher would later describe this realization as a slow poison. She said it began with the bread. The fact that there was bread every morning, white and soft as much as you could eat. The fact that the Americans did not hoard it, did not ration it with a miser's cruelty, did not use it as a tool of control. Bread was power. Bread was life. And the Americans had so much of it that they threw the stale loaves away, tossed them into bins for pig. She watched this happen, watched a kitchen worker scrape half a loaf into the waste, and felt something inside her crack. Because in Germany, in the final months, you killed for bread. You stole from your neighbors. You scraped mold off the crust and ate it anyway, because hunger was a fire in your belly that consumed everything else. And here, in the land of the enemy, bread was garbage. She thought, they have so much. How can they have so much? And then, more dangerously, why were we told they had nothing? The work details began in late January. The women were divided into small groups and assigned tasks: kitchen duty, laundry, clerical work in the administrative offices. They were not forced into hard labor. There were no quarries to break stone in, no forests to clear, no 12-hour shifts in freezing fields. The work was light, almost absurdly so. In the kitchen, they peeled potatoes and washed dishes. In the laundry, they folded sheets and hung uniforms to dry. In the offices, they filed paperwork and typed supply requisitions under the supervision of board-whack sergeants who taught them English phrases and occasionally shared cigarettes. They were paid 10 cents a day in camp scrip, usable at the canteen. The canteen sold chocolate bars, soap, writing paper, toothpaste, combs, handkerchiefs, and small tins of hard candy. The prices were low. A chocolate bar cost 5 cents. A bar of soap, 3. The women stared at the shells as though they were museum exhibits. One woman, Hilda Brandt, a former supply clerk from Mannheim, bought a chocolate bar and held it in her hand for an hour without unwrapping it. She could not believe it was hers. She could not believe she was allowed to have it. When she finally ate it, she did so in small, secretive bites in her bunk after lights out, terrified that someone would take it from her. The chocolate was American Hershey's, thick and sweet and slightly waxy, and it tasted like nothing she remembered from before the war. It tasted like abundance, like a world where scarcity was not the governing principle of existence. The Americans did not understand what they had done. To them, this was routine. The camp operated according to regulations, the prisoners were treated in accordance with international law, and the whole arrangement was frankly a logistical nuisance requiring staff and resources that could have been used elsewhere. But to the German women, every small comfort was a message. The running water said, "We have infrastructure that works." The electric lights said, "Our cities have not been bombed into darkness." The fresh vegetables in the stew said, "Our farmland is untouched." The casual waste, the uneaten food scraped into bins. The worn-out socks discarded instead of mended said, "We have so much that we do not need to save." And beneath it all, unspoken but undeniable, was the implication. We did not need your ideology. We did not need your discipline. We did not need your sacrifices. We were always stronger than you, and we did not have to become monsters to prove it. By February, the psychological disintegration had deepened. The women began to fracture into factions. There were the true believers, perhaps a third of the group who clung to the Nazi ideology with the ferocity of the desperate. They insisted the food was poisoned, that the freedom was a trap, that the war was not truly lost, that the Führer had secret weapons that would turn the tide at any moment. They refused to work. They spat at the American guards. They sang the Horst Wessel-Lied in the barracks at night, quietly, defiantly, as though the anthem could conjure back the world they had lost. They called the others traitors, collaborators, weaklings seduced by enemy propaganda. Then there were the broken women who had collapsed inward, who no longer spoke, who moved through the days like automatons. They had lost husbands, brothers, sons. They had lost homes. They had lost belief. They ate mechanically, slept fitfully, and stared at nothing. The camp psychiatrist, a weary army captain named Morris Stein, diagnosed several with acute depressive episodes and recommended they be monitored for suicidal ideation. There was little he could do. The camp had no psychiatric ward, no therapy beyond brief interviews and sedatives. These women simply endured, waiting for the war to end, waiting to be sent home, waiting for something to make sense again. And then there were the questioners, women like Greta and Ilse, who could not reconcile what they saw with what they had believed. They did not become Americans. They did not renounce their homeland or their people, but they began to ask questions they had never been allowed to ask. If the Americans were not weak, why had they been told so? If the Americans were not cruel, what else had been a lie? If abundance existed here, why had their leaders insisted the only path to survival was conquest and domination? What had they fought for? What had they lost for? These questions were dangerous. They had no answers, but they grew, quietly, in the cold barracks at night, in the library where women read books that had been banned in Germany for over a decade, in the mess hall where the bread never ran out. Questions grew like roots through concrete, slow and relentless, cracking the foundation of certainty. In March, the war in Europe entered its final chaotic phase. News filtered into the camp through censored letters, through whispered conversations with German-speaking guards, through the occasional newspaper allowed in the day room. The Reich was collapsing. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were advancing on Berlin. There were rumors of atrocities, of camps not POW camps, but something else. Something the women could not or would not fully comprehend. Some insisted it was Allied propaganda. Others fell silent, their faces gray. One afternoon, Colonel Brewster arranged a screening in the mess hall. The women were told it was optional, but strongly encouraged. They filed in, confused and wary, and sat on benches as a projector was set up at the front. The lights dimmed. Newsreel footage flickered onto a white sheet hung from the wall. Images appeared. Bergen-Belsen. Buchenwald. Skeletal figures in striped rags staring at the camera. Piles of bodies bulldozed into mass graves, children with hollow eyes and distended bellies, a narrator's voice, flat and factual, explaining what the Allied forces had found when they liberated the camps. Some women walked out. Others sat frozen. Greta Schumacher watched the entire reel, tears streaming down her face, and later could not remember breathing. Ilse Richter, the nurse who had treated POWs in Tunisia, vomited into her lap and had to be escorted outside. The true believers shouted that it was fake. that it was Hollywood trickery, that the Allies had staged it to justify their invasion. But their voices were weaker now, less certain, because even propaganda has limits. Even lies have a shape that can be recognized, and the images on that screen had the weight of truth, the terrible, irrefutable truth that breaks the mind because the mind cannot hold it. That night, several women attempted suicide. One, Margaretha Klein, a communications officer from Hamburg, fashioned a noose from her bedsheet and hanged herself from the ceiling beam. She was found by a bunkmate and cut down in time, her face purple, her eyes bulging. She was taken to the infirmary and restrained. She never spoke again. Another woman, whose name was not recorded in the official reports, cut her wrists with a broken piece of mirror and bled onto the floor of the latrine until she was discovered and bandaged. She survived. She was shipped to a psychiatric facility in New York and disappeared from the records. The camp was locked down. Extra guards were posted. The chaplain made rounds, speaking softly in German, offering prayers that no one wanted to hear. Colonel Brewster sat in her office late into the night, smoking cigarettes and staring at requisition forms she no longer saw, wondering if showing the film had been a mistake, knowing it had been necessary, hating the war and the choices it demanded. Spring came. The war ended. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The women at Fort Devens learned of it 3 days later when the camp loudspeakers crackled to life and a voice announced, in German, that the European conflict had concluded, that the Reich no longer existed, that they were now prisoners of a defeated nation. There was no celebration. There were no cheers. The women sat in the day room, in the barracks, in the yard, and wept. Some wept for joy, for the end of the killing, for the faint hope of seeing family again. Others wept for grief, for the deaths of fathers and brothers and lovers, for the destruction of cities they would never see rebuilt, and others wept for something harder to name, the death of meaning, the collapse of the narrative that had structured their entire adult lives. The camp did not change, the routines continued. The women still worked, still ate, still walked freely within the perimeter. But something had shifted. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were simply prisoners, displaced persons waiting for a broken continent to decide what to do with them. Repatriation was not immediate. Europe was in ruins. The Allied occupation zones were overwhelmed with refugees, POWs, concentration camp survivors, bombed-out civilians. The logistics of sorting and shipping millions of people were staggering, so the women waited. Weeks became months. They planted gardens in the spring soil, small plots of vegetables near the barracks. They were given seeds by the camp administration: carrots, lettuce, beans, and they worked the earth with their hands. These women who had typed orders for tanks and transmitted coordinates for artillery strikes, who had once believed they were part of a glorious future. They harvested the vegetables in summer and ate them in stews, and the act of growing food, of nurturing something instead of destroying it, was a kind of redemption. Small and insufficient, but real. Greta Schumacher volunteered for every work detail. She scrubbed floors, peeled potatoes, typed endless forms in halting English. She worked because work kept the questions at bay, because if she stopped moving, the silence inside her head was unbearable. She began to learn English from the WWII clerks, picking up phrases and idioms, and one day realized she was laughing at a joke, actually laughing, and the sound of her own laughter filled her with shame and relief in equal measure. She thought, I am allowed to laugh. Here, in this place, I am allowed to be human. Ilse Richter spent her days in a library. She read everything she could find, novels, histories, medical journals in English she could barely parse. She read Faust 3 times, searching for answers in Goethe's poetry and the tragedy of a man who bargained his soul for knowledge and power and lost everything. She wondered if Germany had made the same bargain. She wondered if she had. She wrote letters to her sister in Hamburg, long rambling letters full of questions she could not ask directly because the censors would redact them. She asked, are you safe? Is there food? Do the buildings still stand? She did not ask, was it worth it? Did we do this for nothing? Were we monsters? But the questions were there, between the lines, in the ink. By autumn, repatriation had begun. The women were called in groups, alphabetically, and told to prepare for departure. They were given travel papers, a small stipend in occupation script, and inoculations against typhus and cholera. They were issued civilian clothes donated by American relief organizations, dresses and skirts that smelled of mothballs, coats with frayed hems, shoes that almost fit. They packed their few belongings. Letters, photographs, a bar of soap saved as a talisman into cardboard suitcases and lined up by the gate, waiting for the trucks that would take them to the port, to the ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic to a homeland that no longer existed as they remembered it. Greta Schumacher stood in line on a cold October morning, her breath misting in the air, and looked back at the camp one last time. The barracks where she had slept, the mess hall where she had eaten bread every morning, the fence she had once gripped in disbelief. She thought about the girl she had been when she arrived. A true believer, or at least someone who had tried to be, who had swallowed the propaganda because the alternative was to admit that the suffering had no purpose. She thought about the woman she was now, uncertain, angry, grief-stricken, but no longer blind. She did not know what awaited her in Germany. She did not know if her family had survived, if her city still stood, if there would be food or work or hope. She knew only that she could not return to the certainty she had once possessed. That certainty had died here, in this camp where she had been treated not as an enemy but as a person, where the abundance and decency of her captors had dismantled her understanding of the world more completely than any interrogation or punishment could have. As the truck pulled away, she looked through the canvas flaps at the receding camp, at the American flag flapping in the wind above the administrative building, and she thought, "They did not break us with cruelty, they broke us with kindness. And I do not know if I will ever forgive them for that." The return to Germany was a descent into hell. The ships were overcrowded, the passage rough. Many women were seasick for days. They arrived in Bremerhaven in late October to find a city that was barely a city: skeletal ruins, bombed-out husks, streets clogged with rubble. The occupation authorities processed them with bureaucratic efficiency, stamped their papers, and released them into the chaos of the British zone. There was no infrastructure, no jobs. Food was rationed at near starvation levels. The black market ruled. Displaced persons camps overflowed with refugees from the east, with former POWs, with orphans and widows, and the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht. Germany had been divided into zones of occupation. Its sovereignty dissolved, its future uncertain. The women scattered. Some found family mothers who had survived the bombings, siblings who had returned from other camps. Others found only graves, empty lots where homes had stood, neighbors who looked at them with suspicion or indifference. The taint of collaboration clung to anyone who had served the Reich, even in minor capacities. Former Nazi Party members were barred from many jobs. Denazification tribunals interrogated thousands, categorizing them into levels of guilt. The women from Fort Devens were small fish, clerks and typists. But they still had to account for their service, had to swear they had not participated in war crimes, had to prove they were not. Threats to the new order. Some lied. Some told the truth. It hardly mattered. The tribunals were overwhelmed. The process arbitrary. The punishments inconsistent. Greta Schumacher returned to Cologne to find her apartment building reduced to rubble. Her mother was dead, killed in an air raid in 1944. Her brother was missing, last seen on the Eastern Front. She moved into a cellar with 3 other women, sharing a single room heated by a makeshift stove cobbled together from scrap metal. She traded her American coat on the black market for potatoes and coal. She found work as a cleaner in a British Army office, scrubbing floors for occupation forces, and the irony was not lost on her. At night, she lay on her thin mattress and thought about Fort Devens. She thought about the bread, the library, the walks in the open air. She thought about the moment she realized the enemy was not what she had been told, and she wondered if the other women thought about it too, if they woke in the ruins and remembered the camp and felt the same terrible nostalgia, the same shameful longing for captivity because captivity had been safer and kinder than freedom in this broken land. Ilse Richter returned to Munich and found her parents alive but aged beyond recognition. Her father, a postal clerk, had survived the war by keeping his head down, by never joining the party, by pretending ignorance. Her mother wept when Ilse arrived, clutching her daughter as though afraid she would vanish. Ilse did not tell them what she had seen, not the camp at America, not the newsreels, not the questions that gnawed at her in the dark. She resumed her nursing career, working at a makeshift clinic in the ruins, treating tuberculosis and malnutrition and the thousand small injuries of a population barely surviving. She did not speak about the war. None of them did. It was too raw, too close. To speak would be to confront, and confrontation would shatter the fragile normalcy they were trying to rebuild. So they were silent. They worked, they endured, and they buried the past under the rubble of the present. But the questions remained. In quiet moments, waiting in line for rations, lying awake at night, watching children play in the bombed-out streets, the women who had been prisoners at Fort Devens could not escape the central, unbearable question. What if we were wrong? Not just wrong about the war, about the Führer, about the ideology. Wrong about everything. Wrong about the nature of strength and weakness. About civilization and barbarism. About what it meant to be human. They had been taught that might made right, that the strong devoured the weak, that mercy was a luxury only the victorious could afford. And then they had been defeated, captured, and shown mercy by the victors. They had been treated as human beings by the people they had been taught to despise. And this mercy, this decency, had destroyed their certainty more completely than any bomb or bullet. In the decades after the war, some of these women spoke about their experiences. Not many. Oral history projects, academic researchers, the occasional journalist digging into obscure corners of the POW system. They found scattered testimonies, fragmentary interviews, faded letters. Greta Schumacher, in her 1978 interview, said, "I did not understand America until I was its prisoner. And when I understood, I wished I had remained ignorant, because ignorance was simpler. Knowledge is a burden." Ilse Richter, interviewed in 1983 for a German television documentary, said, "They could have treated us like animals. We would have understood that. We would have accepted it. But they treated us like people, and that was unforgivable, because it meant we had to see them as people too. And if they were people, then what were we?" Another woman, whose name was withheld at her request, said in a recorded interview in 1991, "I still dream about the bread. Every week, for 50 years, I have dreamed about that bread. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was ordinary. Because in America, in that camp, bread was ordinary, and I realized that all the speeches, all the promises, all the sacrifices they were. For a world where bread was a weapon, where scarcity was a virtue, where power came from taking, and the Americans had power without taking. They had abundance without conquest, and I could not forgive them because their existence proved we had suffered for a lie. The symbolic objects, the recurring image that threads through every testimony, every letter, every fragmented memory is bread. Not guns, not flags, not even freedom, that abstract, complicated ideal. Bread, white, soft, plentiful bread, served every morning without ceremony, without scarcity, without the threat of deprivation. Bread that was thrown away when it went stale. Bread that represented something the Nazi ideology could never admit, that abundance is not a zero-sum game, that prosperity does not require domination, that strength can coexist with decency. The women at Fort Devens were confronted daily with a material reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. The ideology had promised them greatness through discipline, through sacrifice, through the ruthless elimination of weakness. It had promised them a 1,000-year Reich built on the conquest of inferior peoples, on the efficient extraction of resources, on the transformation of Europe into a German empire. It had promised them meaning through suffering. And in the end, it delivered only suffering. The greatness was a mirage. The empire collapsed in 12 years. The meaning evaporated the moment they saw that the enemy, the weak, decadent, mongrel enemy, had more bread than they could eat. This is not to say that American society was without flaws, without cruelty, without its own deep injustices. The same nation that treated German POWs with relative decency also interned Japanese Americans in desert camps, segregated its military, lynched black citizens, and would soon enter decades of cold, war paranoia, and imperial overreach. The abundance that fed the women at Fort Devens was built on the backs of exploited labor, on the extraction of resources from a global system of inequality. The bread was not innocent. No bread ever is. But in that moment, in that place, the contrast was undeniable. The women had been soldiers, or at least auxiliaries, of a totalitarian state that mobilized every resource for war, that stripped its own people of food and fuel to feed the war machine, that operated on the principle that scarcity justified atrocity, and they had been defeated and captured by a nation that, for all its contradictions, had built a society capable of producing such surplus that its prisoners ate better than its enemies' citizens. This was a strategic advantage as much as a moral one. American industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and economic organization were the material foundation of Allied victory. The bread was propaganda, yes, but propaganda based on truth. The truth that democracy, for all its inefficiencies and failures, had generated wealth that authoritarianism could not match. The truth that a society need not be perfectly just to be stronger than a society built on hate. There is a scene that appears in multiple testimonies described by women who cannot have coordinated their stories, separated by decades and geography. It is the moment weeks or months into their captivity when each woman realized she was no longer afraid, not because the fear had been irrational. It had not been, but because the conditions that produced the fear had proven false. They described standing outside the barracks in the morning, holding a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the Massachusetts hills, and understanding that no one was going to hurt them today, that there would be food, that the guards were bored, not sadistic, that the war, for them, was over, and the ending was not the nightmare they had imagined. And in that realization, they describe a feeling of vertigo, of free fall, as though the ground beneath their feet had vanished. Because if this was false, if the enemy was not monstrous, then what else was false? The justifications for the war, the righteousness of the cause, the necessity of the atrocities whispered about but never spoken aloud. If the Americans were not the barbaric other, then what were the Germans? What had they done? What had they allowed? Some women retreated from these questions. They rebuilt their lives in post-war Germany, married, raised children, and never spoke of the war again. The past became a locked room, visited only in nightmares. Others confronted the questions head-on, joining movements for reconciliation, working with international peace organizations, testifying about their experiences in schools and universities. They said, "We were lied to. Do not believe the lies. Question your leaders. Demand evidence. Do not let certainty become a cage." But for most, the confrontation was private, internal, never fully resolved. They lived with the cognitive dissonance, the knowledge that they had served a monstrous regime, that they had believed its lies, and that they had been treated with a humanity they might not have extended to others. They lived with the guilt not just for what they had done, but for what they had failed to do. The questions they had failed to ask, the evidence they had failed to see. They lived with the memory of bread and the terrible knowledge that bread had unmade them. Fort Devens closed as a POW camp in late 1946. The last of the German prisoners were repatriated by December. The barracks were repurposed, the fences torn down, the camp absorbed back into the sprawling military base that would continue to operate for decades. The records of the camp intake logs, medical reports, work assignments were filed away in the National Archives, accessible but obscure. Footnotes in a war too vast for any one story to dominate the narrative. The women scattered across post-war Germany, and most disappeared into the anonymity of Reconstruction. They became secretaries, nurses, teachers, housewives. They aged, they died. Their children and grandchildren knew fragments of their stories, if they knew anything at all. But the questions they carried. What if we were wrong? What if the enemy was not what we believed? Those questions did not die. They are the questions that haunt every ideology, every certainty, every movement that demands absolute loyalty and punishes doubt. They are the questions that arise when the propaganda meets reality and shatters against it. They are the questions that bread can ask when bread becomes a symbol of everything you were told could not exist. In the end, the women at Fort Devens were not defeated by bombs or bullets. They were defeated by decency, by the simple radical act of being treated as human beings by people they had been taught to hate. This did not make them innocent. It did not erase their complicity, their service to the Reich. Their participation, however, peripheral in the machinery of atrocity. But it made them question, and the question, once asked, cannot be unasked. Epilogue. There is a photograph, uncatalogued and unlabeled, found decades later in a dusty archive box at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It shows a group of women standing outside a barracks at Fort Devens, squinting in the winter sunlight. They wear denim coveralls with PW stenciled on the back. Some are smiling tentatively, others stare at the camera with expressions impossible to read grief. exhaustion, confusion, relief. In the foreground, one woman holds a slice of bread, white and soft, halfway to her mouth. She is not eating. She is looking at the bread as though it is the strangest thing she has ever seen. The photograph has no caption. The women are not named, but the image is a document more eloquent than any report, any testimony, any official record. It is a moment frozen in time, a moment when certainty dissolved, and something else, something fragile and unbearable and true took its place. The bread in that woman's hand is not just food. It is the question. It is the answer. It is the unbridgeable gap between the world as it was promised and the world as it is. It is the symbol of abundance in a philosophy built on scarcity, of mercy in a system built on cruelty, of humanity in an ideology that denied it. It is the thing that cannot be explained away, cannot be rationalized, cannot be forgotten. 70 years later, in a world still scarred by war, still divided by ideologies that promise salvation through sacrifice and dominance, the image of that bread endures. It asks us, what would you do if everything you believed was proven false? What would you do if the enemy showed you kindness? What would you do if certainty collapsed and you were left with only questions, only doubt, only the terrible responsibility of seeing the world as it is, rather than as you were told it must be? The women at Fort Devens learned that freedom is not the absence of walls. It is the ability to walk through them, to question what lies beyond, to choose a different path even when the old path promised meaning. They learned that abundance is not weakness, that decency is not naivety, that the strength to show mercy is greater than the strength to inflict suffering. They learned these lessons in a camp where they were prisoners, and the lessons destroyed them and remade them in ways they could never have anticipated. And the bread simple, white, plentiful was the teacher. The bread that said, the world is larger than your ideology. The truth is more complex than your certainty, and you must choose every day whether to cling to the lie or to face the unbearable weight of reality. This is the legacy of Fort Devens, not a story of heroes or villains, but a story of human beings confronting the collapse of their understanding, of prisoners freed not by the opening of gates but by the breaking of chains they did not know they wore. It is a story told in the language of bread, of small mercies, of the quiet, relentless question. What if we were wrong? And in that question lies the only hope of never building another Reich, of never marching behind another banner of certainty, of never again mistaking cruelty for strength or scarcity for virtue. The question is uncomfortable. It offers no easy answers. But it is the question that must be asked again and again in every generation by every person who claims to know the truth. The women at Fort Devens asked it. And the bread ordinary, abundant, freely given would not let them forget.